evening, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Curmudgeonly Conversation. Tonight's episode could be entitled The Nullifier and the Curmudgeon, because our guest tonight is the outstanding Michael Boldin, the Executive Director of the 10th Amendment Center, which is frankly one of the most effective educational and activism organizations in this entire federal union. Now, these episodes, these interviews, these discussions, these curmudgeonly conversations are available at ji1776.com, and the JI stands for John Irvine. We are actually recording from the Kathy and John Irvine recording studio here in Auburn Hills, Michigan. Also available at the Cerberus Radio Network, thanks to the efforts of our good friend Suzanne Sherman, and soon to be available at the Libertarian Institute. So tonight, as I mentioned, we would like to welcome our very good friend, Michael Boldin. He will give us the other side of the conversation. We heard from Michael Meharry a number of episodes ago, and Mike told us about he and Michael Boldin became friends and how they worked together and how it's such a collegial and wonderful atmosphere. And now we'll give Michael Boldin a chance to either offer a dissenting opinion or to further endorse Michael Meharry's message to us that evening. Michael Boldin, welcome to Curmudgeonly Conversation.
Dennis, this is awesome. Can I be the curmudgeon and you be the nullifier?
Oh, well, bro, we are nullifying curmudgeons and curmudgeonly nullifiers.
Nice. And whatever Meharry said, it's absolutely right. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. It's probably just, yeah, we'll see.
Okay.
Mike's the guy to really listen to.
Okay. Well, you're very kind. Again, perhaps some of the audience is not familiar with your story and that of the 10th Amendment Center and how it got started. And I think that's important. Because one of the things we heard it during the Obama administration, you're hearing it now during the Trump administration. Where were you when this other guy did these things, right? So
Dennis, I love talking to you. I love talking to you. That's great. I love that you started out with that. So I'm a recovering socialist. I would proudly proclaim that I was a Marxist many years ago when I was growing up. I probably wasn't a really good one, but I think I was really just kind of grasping for something outside of the two-party system. Mm-hmm. And I thought they were both bad and both disgusting, and neither of them ever drew me to vote in my younger years. I was born in 72, so I'm in my mid-40s now. So we're talking throughout the 1990s. I just really, I paid attention to some things, but basically I just thought they were all repulsive. But because I went to government-run schools, in a city that I had lived under a socialist mayor almost my entire childhood, that's Milwaukee, Wisconsin, you would vote for D or R or S. And this guy, Henry Mayer, was a proclaimed socialist for a long time. And I think he was probably mayor for a couple of decades there. So the idea that government should do everything was just kind of ingrained in my head. And I think a lot of us actually come from that. I mean, if you think about it, like even if you go to a private school, you're still under some kind of government rules or approval for that private school to be operating. So I was taught in almost every situation. I went to Catholic school, and then I went to public school for high school. And I was taught in almost every situation that the solution to every problem was government. So I remember in the airline bailouts, was this like late 80s, early 90s? My initial thought on the airline bailouts was like, oh man, if they're pouring all that money into the airlines, why doesn't the government just own it? And, and I laugh about that as I think about it now. But that was my natural instinct. And that's how I think, at least for me, I can certainly understand where a lot of people are coming from with their gut instinct when they come from the left, because we've had this type of socialist garbage slammed down our throats since we're like 4, 3, 5 years old, so young. And so that's our first thought. We think it's logical. I thought I was so smart when I came up with that idea on my own, supposedly. But it took a long time to get through that. And we were talking before we started recording, Dennis, you had mentioned you wanted to maybe bring up Harry Brown, but Harry is an author, and he was doing a podcast at the time. He's passed away now, a great libertarian writer. He wrote this book, Why Government Doesn't Work, and amongst a number of other ones, and ran as a Libertarian Party presidential candidate in 96 and 2000, I believe. And I would listen to Harry's podcast while I was working this part-time customer service job late at night. I'd be listening to his radio show. I guess it was podcast before podcast. And I kept hearing all these examples of how government would promise something and it would either fail at doing what it was going to do, it would lie about what it was going to do, or if it actually accomplished it, it would just cost $1 zillion. So I used to listen to Free Talk Live pretty regularly, this radio show from the Free State in New Hampshire. And Mark and Ian would often come up with this example. I think it was Mark who was the co-host there. He would come up with this example. He's like, yeah, government can buy a Honda. It might spend $100,000 on a Honda Accord, but it can do it. So these are the types of examples, and it just started making sense. But where it made most sense to me, and I'm sorry to just ramble here, but that was a big question you asked, Dennis. Where it makes the most sense to me was always on foreign policy, because government was always talking about protecting us and war for peace and things like that. And it always just seemed to make things worse. That was how I started to see things. And I became an anti-war activist the first day that the Iraq War started in 2003, the day the bombs were dropping in early 2003. I remember being out on the street with all the leftist organizations that I worked with for a number of years and helped organize events, and had police trying to run me over. And it was a mess, obviously. It still is to this day. I mean, we hear about what's happening in Iraq. There's all kinds of violence today. It just keeps going and going and going. This foreign meddling has created so many problems across our entire society around the globe.
Well, it certainly has. And of course, as Tom Woods likes to point out, we have so many friends. I came not from the left or Marxism, but I guess I thought of myself as a right-wing Republican.
Yeah.
And not particularly neocon-ish ever. Unlike Mike, he mentioned that
Mike was definitely a neocon.
Right. I think I was never there, but Tom Woods, who does such wonderful work, points out some of the ironies. One of which is that people that are very skeptical of big government at home, seem to not realize that the interventionist foreign policy is an example of that overseas and has so many negative effects, including here at home.
Yes.
And so we're all having a debate right now about that because of President Trump's announcement that he made today.
So I would say it also goes the other direction too, because I mean, we're not talking about the worst of the worst, the neocons, and then the mainstream liberals, the Hillary Clintons, the Lindsey Grahams. These are unrecoverable human beings in my view. Right. But like, if you talk about real people who really want to be a constitutional conservative or a far left progressive. So I would say on the left, you can flip that around. A lot of the far left progressives don't like the foreign policy overseas, but don't recognize that a large government at home actually empowers that as well. So I think it goes both directions. And then we just, as long as we can stay consistent, whether we're libertarian or constitutionalist or 10th or whatever, or if we don't even self-identify as anything, I don't care what your pronoun is for who you are, but if you're consistent in your principles on these types of issues, sooner or later, more and more people start to listen to what you have to say. We often work in coalition, and Dennis, I think you've experienced that with us for a long time. We'll work with groups on the left, like ACLU, on surveillance issues, and they think we're absurd when it comes to protecting the right to keep and bear arms, but we're going to continue having the same principle. My belief is that the more consistent you are, whether it's like Ron Paul or someone else, sooner or later someone's going to say, you know what, I agree with them on this. You know, maybe they aren't lying to me on this other issue. And that's, I think, the best that we can do is continue speaking the truth and trying to give examples of what's right as often as possible.
It's a great point, Michael. And when you think about it, what we're dealing with is opposition to the state, which is opposed to our liberty and our inalienable rights granted by the Creator, Thomas Jefferson wrote, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's, you know, the whole idea was sold that it was going to secure those rights, but we see that in the vast majority of times it actually attacks them rather than secures them. And I think something I wanted to mention about Harry Brown, and again, I feel very old now because I graduated from high school the year that you were born, but a few years after that, Harry came out with his book, How You Can Profit from the Coming Devaluation.
Oh yeah, great book.
It is. It was a classic, and that introduced me to Harry Brown.
Yes.
And then something he did that I think was quite instructive. I remember getting probably about the time that you were following some of these things that you mentioned in the late 80s, early 90s, these emails from the late Harry Brown.
Yeah.
And at one time I thought, boy, this guy he's always hammering at the politicians and the bureaucrats, the politicians and
Yes.
the bureaucrats. And I said, that was actually, we should remember that. Because sometimes when we make the arguments, or our leaders make the arguments, if they use the pronoun us, or we are doing this, or, some people bridle at that. And they say, well, we know what the fellow means, but it's really the politicians and the bureaucrats that are doing these things, and that's what we need. And so we emphasize that's a good thing. But then at some point, you began to look at the 10th Amendment and this concept of nullification. And interestingly, it's something that Murray Rothbard, the late and extremely great Dr. Murray Rothbard, one of our great libertarian scholars, had talked about. And I guess it was in the mid 2000s that you really were working heavily with this and began the 10th Amendment Center. Is that what happened there, Michael? At some point, you moved to Los Angeles from Milwaukee.
Yeah, I grew up in Milwaukee, and I left. I mean, you understand the weather being in Michigan, right?
Right.
Some of us are not built for that type of thing, and I prefer my tyranny to be warm and comfortable. So in the mid-'90s, I was in college, and I transferred. I was going to Marquette University. Okay. I transferred to USC here in Southern California. I moved to LA and just never really looked back. But this is where I actually got involved in my activism, at least as far as being an anti-war activist after the Iraq War started. And I was working with a lot of the far left organizations. Unfortunately, when George Bush was in office, if you were anti-war, you're a leftist. And then now when Obama was in office, most of the people opposing his foreign policy were conservatives or constitutionalists. And it seems that there's very few people that are going to be consistent across the board. So I was working with a lot of these leftist organizations. There was one called California Peace Action that they focused just on war and peace. There was another one called Answer Coalition. They're all over the world, actually. And Answer is a hard Marxist organization, so hardcore that my good buddy Nick Hancock, if you remember, you know Nick. So Nick, at the time, he was doing these End the Fed rallies after the switch from Bush to Obama. And we used to have 10, 15,000 people marching in the streets against the wars when Bush was in office. Once Obama came in, of course, the wars continue and ramp up, but the opposition to it in the streets is almost gone. So Nick kept trying to do these End the Fed and anti-war protests, primarily for libertarians. And Answer Coalition was still doing theirs, but the numbers, instead of 10,000 people, would be like 20 or 30 for each group. So Nick reached out to Answer Coalition, went to their office in Hollywood and said, you know what, how about you drop the message of more healthcare, less warfare, and I'll drop the End the Fed, and we can just focus on one issue that we agree on, ending war. And the Answer guys said to him, no way, we'll never do that, because that tells me that a lot of times groups that are opposed to one thing, they're really just using that as a tool to promote something else. And I think groups like Answer primarily do it to promote socialism. So they'll latch on to anything. And I remember this great documentary with Pete Seeger about Pete Seeger's life some years ago. And they talked about him. And Pete was known he was blacklisted for being a communist for a long, long time. A great musician, a great peace advocate. But he talked about why he associated with communists. They said, well, do you consider yourself one now? And he said, no, not really. But at the time, I was anti-war, and the only people who were anti-war when I was doing it were the commies. So, of course, I worked with them. I was against racism, so were the communists at the time were opposed to that, so I joined with them. So I understand why people latch on to groups based on one issue or another, but unless we lead them towards liberty and opposition to this state power on every other issue, we're going to have problems.
Indeed, and so you've been using, and the 10th Amendment Center has been utilizing this concept of nullification, which Thomas Jefferson called the rightful remedy, the moderate middle ground between abject submission to tyranny and potential violence, either through revolution or secessionism, even though obviously he wrote the Declaration of Independence, so he thought secessionism, you might get to a point where it's too late to do anything else, and you have to separate. He said it was the right and the duty at certain points, but he also said, let's try this nullification, which Madison called interposition. How did you get to that point, and how did you get the group started, Michael?
So I just literally started it as a blog in 2006. I'm like, I got to do something different than hanging out with these lefties so much. They're getting so many things wrong. I was listening to more and more Harry. I was reading more and more books, and I was recognizing that, government was bad on foreign policy, but it was also bad on everything domestically too. And I just started blogging this 10thamendmentcenter.com website, literally a one-person blog. My goal was to point out that the Bush administration at the time was bad on basically everything, whether it was the Patriot Act, the war on drugs, the Real ID Act, foreign policy, banker bailouts, whatever it may be over those years. And I started the blog I actually bought the website domain in mid-2006 and then really got things going. I think my first blog entry may have been 6 months later, but my goal was just to reach a handful of people, maybe 1-2 people, to open their eyes to think about this. And I kept doing it, and then more and more people wanted to participate, and we have more and more bloggers add on. And then I started seeing, it was primarily through the Real ID Act, where a number of states were just not wanting to participate or implement this federal law. Between that and the fact that when I first moved here in 1995 and then into 1996, the fact that California was legalizing a plant, marijuana, even though the federal government was telling them they couldn't. So I started kind of seeing this strategy playing out, and I'm thinking, just because the federal government says something, that doesn't mean it actually has to happen. And then as I learned, and you talk about Thomas Jefferson, we can even go further back to Patrick Henry and the resistance with he and people like Samuel Adams to the Stamp Act. They literally just did not participate in the enforcement of it. They resisted it openly. Sometimes they just used resolutions or speeches, but they opposed it in every way strategically possible to make sure that it couldn't get enforced. And this is a part of the American tradition that the government-run schools never teach us. So my eyes were like wide open. I'm like, man, we can apply this to everything. And we've slowly built an infrastructure to continue working on how to educate people on how to apply it to what's important to them, but then also get involved in reporting and updating people on how things are playing out on various issues, whether it's the right to keep and bear arms, trying to nullify federal gun control, trying to nullify federal control over money in the Federal Reserve, or the surveillance state. Whatever it may be, we can probably get a foot in the door and undermine federal programs that shouldn't exist in the first place.
Right, and we should emphasize that while the nullification movement is particularly focused on fighting against federal tyranny, it's not saying, well, if there's tyranny at the local or state level, that's okay. But
no.
Right. So that's not what it's doing. But the whole
idea, I mean, we've probably, you've read a little Mises, right? I mean, you mentioned Rothbard. We understand, if we believe in markets and we believe in freedom, we understand what division of labor is. I don't go to a tire company and ask them, why don't you guys carry fried chicken? I mean, everybody does a piece of it. And what we specialize in is teaching people about the proper role of government under the Constitution, how things are supposed to be, but more importantly, how to take action to undermine and nullify in practice federal laws or regulations that shouldn't exist. There are other organizations, Libertas Institute in Utah, run by the great Connor Boyack, who we both know, right, Dennis? Connor has done a great job, and he started out as an activist running a Utah 10th Amendment Center, but he wanted to focus primarily on advancing liberty on a state and local level. So people can create organizations to do that on a state-by-state basis, a county-by-county basis, whatever it may be, and they can develop that expertise. But where we fit in the grand scheme of things, the pieces of the puzzle, is resisting federal power. I would say the federal government is the largest government, the largest empire the world has ever seen, and to me, that's the most important one to go after. Other people may have other priorities, and I encourage them to do as much as they can on what's important to them.
Right. And Michael, the point here would be that the federal government impacts us all, and also has many partnerships with local and state agencies as well to violate our rights. So this is clearly a key point to make. And as you pointed out, and you did some great writing on this, about the nullification of the Stamp Act before the American Revolution, or the American secession from the British Empire, of the 13 free and independent states. Mm-hmm. And then during the constitutional ratification process, it's interesting to consider how the anti-ratification group was quite concerned about this allegedly limited new government becoming tyrannical and overwhelming everybody. And the pro-ratification group, which we call the Federalists, even though they weren't really Federalists, but they said, or at least in many cases they weren't.
I mean, they were Federalists in comparison to everyone we have. Even the big government. Okay, we'll set aside Hamilton, but even the big government people of the time, if we had all of those people in today, they would be amazing compared to 99.9% of all politicians who've ever lived in my lifetime.
Okay, but the anti-federalist moniker for the anti-ratification group, at least I think that historically looks like that was probably unfair.
It was a propaganda term.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
They wanted to make the one side look like they were in support of federalism, and the people who didn't support ratification of the new Constitution were supposedly seen as anti-federalists. But a lot of these so-called anti-federalists actually saw that as a term of art. They felt they were really the true federalists,
right,
and that the Constitution was more centralizing in power than what they had under the Articles of Confederation, which is absolutely true.
Right. In fact, one of our previous guests was Sheldon Richman, and we talked about that. Yes. And I said, well, he did this lecture, and I saw the video about the rats and and he was chuckling about the rats and the anti-rats. I said, that was brilliant. He goes, well, actually, he said it wasn't his idea. He got it from Elbridge Gerry or Jerry,
yes, in Massachusetts. Yes,
right, got that idea there. But but the other point is what I think is interesting. We have at least one mutual friend, probably more, that I can think of, who will say, and so I know you've heard and seen this. The Constitution failed. This was like the Lysander Spooner argument. Which Madison,
I love Spooner.
Which Madison anticipated, right? He said parchment barriers. Yes. Right. Okay. So
you know exactly where I'm going with that one, but go ahead.
Okay. So, but I say, well, and again, Tom was just talking about this as well. I said I want to use all the tools in all the arrows in our quiver to fight against tyranny, and so you could make it. I think the argument that at least say, well, the Constitution was sold on a certain basis. And so you can say, let's take the arguments of the Federalists who urged ratification, and well, this is what they said to do, all right? And the Anti-Federalists said that they didn't think it was going to work out the way that it was promised, but here's what the Federalists have argued. So even if you can use that as a way to A, open people's eyes to what's going on, and B, there are some methods, as you mentioned, Madison talking about non-cooperation with the officers of the Union. That was James Madison, who was instrumental in getting the convention going. Now, people dispute whether or not he was really the father of the Constitution, right? That's an interesting discussion. And then, of course, he was the fourth president of the United States. And this is what he said to do. And, of course, we see what Jefferson said to do. Political decentralization is really maybe the overall concept that we're looking at here. Political decentralization is a tool to liberty, right?
Yeah, and Mises, for example, talked about this in his great work, Liberalism in the Classical Tradition. I'm going to be talking about that. Mises, the great decentralizer, at the Mises Institute's annual supporters dinner, which is here in Los Angeles at the end of the month. But this isn't just this concept of decentralization as a tool to advance one's goals. For us, the goal, I would think, Dennis, is liberty. Technically, decentralization, I did an interview maybe last year with Jeff Deist from Mises, saying that I would give the exact same advice to someone who wanted to advance a progressive, big government, anti-liberty, whatever agenda, that I would for someone who wants to advance liberty. The techniques work whatever your personal goal. The fact of the matter is, a one-size-fits-all solution, whatever you are in love with, is really bad for whatever you want. Because A, you never get what you want. And then B, we can go back to Harry Brown. Every time you empower someone to do in government something that you like today, someone in the future is going to take that same power and use it against you or in ways that you don't like. So even if you're a big government progressive, it's really a bad choice to support larger government. For example, the left absolutely hates Donald Trump, right? I don't think there's any disagreement with that statement. They think he is the worst president in history, possibly the most dangerous man on the face of the earth. So instead of saying, you know what, we should start looking more inward, we should focus all of our efforts more close to home, like we saw on now 33 states who are successfully defying Washington, D.C. on cannabis, on marijuana legalization to some form or another. Instead of looking at that as a strategy, every proposal coming from the left seems to call for more and more bigger and bigger government, whether it's the Green New Deal or whatever it may be, larger EPA, healthcare. They keep calling for more government after seeing that government can be run in a way they absolutely hate. Do they think this is an abomination and it's never going to happen again? Only a fool would ever do that.
Yes, well, there are a lot of fools involved in the political process, so I guess. Yeah. But
we should be kinder, right? I should keep my mouth shut.
No. But there is a lot of that, and there's a lot of not learning from the past.
Yes.
As Robert Hicks talks about the truncating of the antecedents, there's a lot of that.
Yes.
That goes on. But so the point would be, I think, as we look at this, as you say, through the decentralization, we do a number of things. I mean, I think of it as a tool for liberty. I guess as you point out, you say, well, the other point is non-liberty people could like it too, because again, you give a lot of power to that big government. The next group gets in charge. But it always seems like if you have big government, it's not going to be very friendly to liberty. I would think.
Of course not. But here, the way I think of it is probably, if I'm not being clear, maybe there are a lot of people who love the state in our society. If you don't, you're at such a tiny minority. Even if you think that your view is universal and should somehow exist everywhere, there aren't enough people who agree with you or any of us on that to even make that practical or realistic. So the best step forward then, as Mises told us back in 1927, as the founders, as James Madison, Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, and so many of the other great revolutionaries and founders told us, that the solution to that, when you have a society that has so many different political, economic, social, religious viewpoints, is to allow people to have their viewpoints in their own area. If there were two different stores next to each other and one of them was managed poorly, you would probably go to the store right next door, and that's how you learn what works and what doesn't. I personally believe that if California was able to implement a universal health care program, and right next door in Arizona it was a total free market program, I think over a very short period of years, people would learn which one was awful and which one wasn't pretty quickly. But when you have these kind of quasi-government, private, and partly socialized but partly not situations, people really never learn what's right and wrong. One-size-fits-all solutions are bad for just the education of society as well, because we're not testing and seeing with our own eyes how things don't work. And weed, I think, is a great example of that. Back in the mid-'90s, when that first happened here in California, the Proposition 215 passage in late '96, people thought this was insane. And when I first started doing my work, just a decade later, I would talk to groups on the right, and they would try to run me out on a rail for talking about marijuana. But you don't really get that response anymore. People recognize that even if they don't necessarily support using something, that it's the right of the people in each state or each city, whatever it may be, to make this decision. And then the world doesn't come to an end. I believe, and you may call me nuts, I believe if the same approach was used on the right to keep and bear arms, eventually the left would learn that when people decide to defend themselves or own something where they can defend themselves and their property and their family, let's say in Oklahoma, maybe the left will learn eventually that the world won't come to an end. But it's going to take a lot of examples to prove that.
Well, that's a good point. And I would say the other thing that we see developing here, I mean, you talk about the competition between the states. I also used to think of the panarchy idea that people have. That say, well, you could have, with technology now, it's almost like an anarchistic situation, but one where with panarchy, some people could say, I choose to live under this government, and I choose to live under that government. And they could be the same geographical area, but that sort of thing. And speaking of the gun rights, for instance, I think this is not the first time we've seen this, but did I just see, I was at the 10th Amendment Center website or Facebook page, that there is a sheriff in Colorado, and this is something you guys have talked about, sanctuary counties or sanctuary cities for gun rights, as we could have also sanctuary for the unborn in terms of the abortion issue and other things of that nature. So this decentralization thing with the gun rights seems to be picking up with this idea that there could be sanctuaries where people would say, the right to be armed for self-defense is a natural right, the right to own property is a natural right, and we're going to resist all federal attacks on it, maybe even state-level attacks on it, and not because of the Second Amendment, just because it's the naturally right thing to do.
Yeah.
And if you're going to be a Second Amendment president or a Second Amendment person, you can't say just enforce the current laws. all of those federal gun laws are unconstitutional, as well as being
Yes.
attacks on our natural rights, and so they need to be repealed and or not cooperated with, so they make no difference anyway.
The only thing that the ATF is authorized to do under the Constitution is disband. Those people need to get a job, but their very existence, every day that they take a paycheck from the ATF, they're basically stealing. The founders used to call this usurpation. Usurpation is a theft of power that doesn't belong to the government. It is, as St. George Tucker, the great legal mind from the early 1800s called it, he said it was treason against the sovereignty of the people every time they do something outside of the Constitution. And there is no authority, period, for the federal government to regulate, control, ban any firearms, whether it's the 1934 National Firearms Act, the Gun Control Act of 1968, its amendments in 86, the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988, any of these. I mean, they can say, the Second Amendment doesn't say the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed unless the government doesn't know you have the gun. I mean, it doesn't say that, or it would have said that in the first place. So the right to keep and bear arms is being infringed constantly. There is no such thing as a Second Amendment president. I know we have one in current times that has claimed that they was going to be that, but absolutely not, and not even close. The amount of enforcement on the federal level is atrocious, and it keeps getting worse. In fact, the Trump administration, if we really wanted to get into it, I actually make the case is worse than Barack Obama, who many rightly saw as potentially one of the worst gun grabbers in history. But the Trump administration, and Donald Trump specifically himself, bragged about doing more federal enforcement than anyone in history in the fiscal year of 2018 on federal gun control. And for those of you who think that, oh, the laws are on the books, it's his job to enforce them, absolutely not. His job is to follow his oath to the Constitution, and Thomas Jefferson himself told us that when you, as president, believe that a law is unconstitutional, it is your job to do everything possible to ensure that it is not enforced, and let them impeach if they don't like that.
Well, that's an excellent segue to another topic.
You might enjoy that one.
Yes, thank you. Hey, what's the matter? Would you rather have Hillary? Sorry, I'm just kidding. That's the rejoinder, right?
Hillary was disgusting, but you know what? The whole, you know, and it is funny that you mentioned that, and I get the joke, but a lot of people believe that just because you oppose one president doing something bad, it means you support the other one. No, these people are all awful. I support the Constitution and I support liberty. It doesn't matter what name is attacking it. They're all bad.
Right. The name or the political party label, those are meaningless. And George Washington warned us about that, right? In the farewell.
Oh, yes.
Oh boy, there's so many topics here. So okay, I want to bring up the impeachment thing, but also discuss George Washington's farewell address. But before we get to Washington's farewell address, okay, the impeachment thing. This topic has come up, you know, and interestingly, we had at one of our local Republican clubs, and I was the MC of the meeting. A local congressman was asked about this by somebody, and John was recording this meeting, and we had some people we didn't recognize. Mm-hmm. They must have known he was going to be there, and the next day, it's on the Rachel Maddow show. Interesting.
Oh, wow.
Interestingly enough, but
I've also been on the Maddow show.
Yes, you
but
have
it wasn't.
Yeah.
She was not very nice. She spent about 15 minutes talking about how awful and racist and neo-Confederate the 10th Amendment Center is for working to nullify Obamacare and gun control and basically everything else. And so, of course, she did not like that. And I had written an article in response to what MSNBC did. This is while Obama was still in office, and LouRockwell.com had published it. And Lou was so kind to actually write back. He says, you know, the pin hurts, Michael, but this is a badge of honor. So I think when they attack you, you recognize that you don't catch flack unless you're over the target.
Exactly. Okay. So, but let's go over that now, and we'll get to impeachment after this. But her attack, and of course, it's the typical thing you see from people like that. The phony charge of racism, the distortions of history. Perhaps you could tell the audience the role that nullification played, as well as perhaps interposition, in fighting against slavery in the mid-19th century, and our native states of Wisconsin and Michigan, for example, and other states. I think New Hampshire was another one, and how people in the North fighting against the Fugitive Slave Act and that awful institution of slavery, how they utilized nullification to defend human freedom back then.
Yeah, the short version, and I think this is being broken down more and more year by year, is that the establishment wants you to believe that if you resist a federal act, you're a racist, you support slavery, you want segregation. That's the only reason you could ever want decentralization. And a lot of people, knee-jerk reaction, have believed that over the years, but I don't think nearly as many. The fact of the matter is, and we've been doing a lot of work on this for years now, we've taught people that it was the other way around, actually. The Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which was a follow-up to the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, was widely hated in northern states for decades. And every single state in the North, you mentioned Michigan, there's, of course, Ohio, Wisconsin, Massachusetts, Vermont was very prominent. They all passed what were called personal liberty laws to either frustrate, block, or directly nullify the enforcement of the federal slavery law. The federal slavery law basically required everyone to act as a slave catcher and help catch people and send them into bondage in the South. This worked very closely with people like Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad to promote freedom, not the other way around. But that's the short version of that particular era in history.
And there were some famous Americans, even today. Was Walt Whitman one of them? Did he say, I am a nullifier?
Yeah, Walt Whitman actually absolutely said that, and so did John Greenleaf Whittier, who opposed the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. Yeah, it was just very popular, clearly, to resist this. I mean, Daniel Webster was absolutely hated. He went to Syracuse, which was known as the great underground depot of the. It was the great depot of the Underground Railroad. That's how it was known. And he went to the middle of this anti-slavery convention in the 1850s, and he was basically warning the people of Syracuse that the federal government was going to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act right here in Syracuse, no matter what you did. But they used a combination of all kinds of things, not providing resources to help implement the federal act, plus jury nullification once people were actually captured, using juries to set people free, even though the government wanted to keep them in bondage. So this was a very strong kind of fight between the feds and the states, but it's not the way that we've been taught in school. It's the other way around. The nullifiers were the winners.
Right. A very, very good point. And you alluded to something. Due process was under attack during this time.
And now.
As it is now, right.
We've all heard no fly, no buy from somebody, and that is an attack on due process. I don't think there should be any government that's taking that type of approach, but due process has been under attack for a long, long time, and what the states were doing in response to that. So basically, the Fugitive Slave Act said that if you were a black person and a white person came up from, let's say, Missouri, for example, and said, that's my property, you would go in front of this type of a magistrate, not a real court, and the so-called commissioner, or not really a judge, would get paid $10 if he said that you were a slave and had to go to the South, or $5 if you could get set free in the North. And so there was a financial incentive to send people back to slavery. And I'm not sure where I was going with that. Oh, but a lot of places, you couldn't even, if you were a black person, you weren't even allowed to testify on your own behalf. The federal law specifically said that this person's testimony doesn't count. So what a lot of states were doing, even though the feds said they couldn't, said they would just have habeas corpus, due process anyways. The Habeas Corpus Act in Vermont is probably one of the most famous examples of that.
Okay. These are things people should be studying. They can read about this at the 10th Amendment Center. There's a lot of resources there, and those resources will then point you to other things that you could read to get further in-depth study on that. And of course, now right after the Civil War, which or the war against Southern independence, or whatever people want, war of federal aggression, but there was impeachment, right, of Andrew Johnson, and then we had threatened impeachment of President Clinton. And now we have threatened impeachment of President Trump. And people have looked at this and said, well, gee, is this really something where there's something that needs to be brought up, where a crime or a potential crime that should be subject to the articles of impeachment? Or is it an attempt to overthrow the election returns from 2016? Maybe it's a little both. But some of our historical friends have pointed out something, historians, something that you pointed out in one of your recent, I'll call it lunchtime, I think it's at 12:30 our time, where you go on, and I forgot what you call this that you do now. You did one
Path to Liberty. It's Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 12:30 Eastern.
Right, the Path to Liberty. So you did a segment on this about impeachment, and
Yes.
you brought up a point that I've seen others, Kevin Gutzman, the great historian, among others, many people have commented. They said, well, you know, there have been either impeachable acts or things that certainly look like they could be considered that going on for over a century now.
Easily, yes.
Right. Okay. So then you say, okay, whether or not such a thing has occurred with President Trump, should we or should we not do it? But one could argue that, gee, all the potential division that would come out of this, all the rancor, and now we're going to do this where it's been ignored. Maybe it's a remedy whose time has come and gone or something. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about what your research found, Michael, in terms of presidents and judges, and then perhaps potential expulsion of senators and congressmen, because I've got to believe that most of them are people that are very studiously following their oath of office, or would that be naive? Maybe this is a long-running problem.
Well, you know, there's so many layers to it, because I agree that every single president that I've lived under should have been impeached. Every one of them. Not one deserves to be in that office, because they take an oath to the Constitution. That is their only job, is to follow the Constitution. So every single day the National Firearms Act and Gun Control Act are being enforced, this is a violation of the Constitution. Every single day that they carry on a war in a foreign land without a declaration of war from Congress is a violation of their oath to the Constitution. But unfortunately, no one will ever get impeached for those things, because Congress, as a broad stroke here, they love the executive branch having this kind of power. They just want their own team to have it. So unfortunately, impeachment is not used the way it's supposed to be used. It's just used as a political tool to bludgeon people. People love the Constitution when it fits their personal political goals, and they treat it like toilet paper every other time. And that goes for Nancy Pelosi. That goes for Lindsey Graham. That goes for everybody in Washington, D.C., basically, and has been that way for a long, long time. But none of these people are really following their oath to the Constitution. I mean, the founders would not approve of a government with $23 trillion in debt, and we're not even talking about the unfunded part of it. We're not even talking Social Security and all that. It's much, much worse. They would not approve of a system where there are military installation or bases of some sort of presence in 170 countries around the world. The founders didn't set up a new constitution to do that. Not even close. They did not set up a government that was going to spy on basically everything that you do without a warrant. They didn't want gun control. They didn't want the federal government running and controlling and funding education, or an EPA. They didn't want any of this stuff. So I think there is a strong case for maladministration, high crimes and misdemeanors for every president in my lifetime, at least, and probably much further back than that. Unfortunately, no one will ever impeach for those types of things, because they're all bad guys and they don't want to expose themselves to their own problems. The thing is, and I don't really get into crime TV shows, for example, so I'm not really up to date on the nitty-gritty of the phone call with Ukraine and this guy saying that and this guy saying that, and I don't really even want to follow that. So if they can't, the bottom line about that is, if they can't actually prove a real crime there, they're going to have to rely on high misdemeanors. And I would say everyone that would basically support an impeachment on that ground is opening themselves up to a lot of problems, because high misdemeanors would include maladministration of the government, and Obamacare in and of itself really fits that bill.
Right, and this goes back to the famous commentary by St. George Tucker that you referenced earlier.
Yes.
And perhaps when I get done with my little oration about it, you can remind people who St. George Tucker was, because they'll say, well, I never heard of that guy. He was very important. But he did say, as you pointed out, that taking undelegated authority was a usurpation of power. I think I got this right. And a usurpation of power is a treason. Treason is defined in the Constitution in Article 3, Section 3 as making war against the states, plural. And Tom DiLorenzo's done great work talking about that. But St. George Tucker said, I think it was in the 1820s or something, that the usurpation of power is a treason against the sovereignty of the people. And when you consider how much of this has gone on, and they throw the word treason around a lot, and they come up with the National Defense Authorization Act indefinite detention provisions in 2012. Lindsey Graham stands up in the Senate and says, if you are in violation of this, you shut up. You don't get a lawyer. And what does Lindsey Graham do? He gives support to associated groups. He's doing it now by complaining about getting troops out of Syria, where the U.S. intervention in Syria, besides being unlawful, has been
shouldn't be in there in the first place, of course.
Right, and it's been helpful, as has been the enabling of the Saudi war crimes in Yemen. These things are helping Al Qaeda. These things are helping ISIS. So these hypocrites are guilty of treason.
Patrick Henry thought that impeachment should be used for a violation of duty. And now you can't just rely on one person. Of course, we've got people like George Nicholas, James Madison, Edmund Randolph, Alexander Hamilton. They all had kind of the same view on it. But I think Patrick Henry was really clear. He said impeachment is for a violation of duty. His words, not mine. And the only duty, again, that I think anyone in government has is their oath to the Constitution. Now, unfortunately, most people in Congress, the House and the Senate, don't know what the hell that is, and they don't care about it, or if they do know what it is, they're hoping you and I don't. So they're not going to impeach on that because they're exposing themselves. Well, if you're impeaching on this war issue, why do you keep voting against defunding the activities helping the war against the people of Yemen, for example? They can't take that position because they're exposing themselves for their own crimes. So they're going to have to get into this nitty-gritty, he said, she said garbage, which really isn't helping the structure that we're facing, the problems that we're facing in the long run. It isn't actually a good thing. It's just literally a political move. And we know Alexander Hamilton in Federalist, either 65 or 66, I think 66, referred to it as really, it is a political process. Impeachment is. So we shouldn't be surprised about this. The founders did acknowledge that it would be that, but they also thought that people in this country would not allow things to get this bad. I mean, so we've got a real problem on our hands.
Right. And they say, what would they say now? And they actually talked about what if that were to happen. And Jefferson said, you might have to take more serious action. But at least with the thing with the nullification movement, we may be able to do de facto secessionism if we do enough nullification to separate ourselves from the tyrannical Leviathan in Washington, D.C. And in fact, you had people often ask this question: what about the flow of money and the flow of tax money? And I remember that 2 or 3 years ago, you had a very interesting thing that you wrote, and you said something about escrow accounts at the state level, and then more than one state would have to do it, but that might be a way for us to make some progress in this area.
Yeah, I generally shy away from that. Like, there are strategies on how to deal with a lot of stuff that I think are just too far ahead of where we are as a society. I hate to use such a collectivist term, but I'm not sure how else to put it. But you don't get from point A to point Z, we'll say, point W in one step. You have to get piece to piece to piece. And so until people learn that the right of self-determination, that's how Mises talked about it in Liberalism, that great book in 1927, I think it was. The right to self-determination, that's people of whatever size in whatever area making their own decisions about their own lives in their own area. People are afraid of that bringing the end of the world or violence, whatever. You have to prove to them first that it doesn't happen like that. And again, we've seen this happen on marijuana. We've been told for so many years that this was going to bring about all kinds of horrible things. And I know some people will still make that argument, but there are very few of them left to date because they see that people are earning a living doing this, engaged in business. And I think, again, this can be applied to other issues. And the more that you expand it, the more likely it is that someone will along the line say, well, why are the feds doing this and this and this? And over time, some smarter people than maybe myself or any of us here will come up with a way to deal with the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that is the IRS and the Federal Reserve. We like chipping away at that. We like supporting the use of sound money. We like supporting the use of cryptocurrency. Anything that is outside the Federal Reserve System, I think, is actually helpful to advance freedom and liberty on a state, local, individual, business, community level. And as we chip away on that, I think we can take bigger steps in the future.
Well, that's an interesting point. Something else, again, you brought up the marijuana issue, But all these things, when you look back, of course, we know there was no constitutional authority delegated to the federal government to do anything about that.
Yep.
We also know, because reading their writings and seeing the speeches, I mean, Jefferson, among others, they said, if you granted the government the right to tell you what you could or could not consume, right, that was, and he said, there's no way they would have agreed to that, and clearly they didn't. But to enforce all of these things requires gun control in particular, but not just that, but also on marijuana and everything else. At the end of the day, it requires the initiation of force for them to do this. And you end up with situations like with this vast prison system, for instance, which is a beneficiary of the attacks on our rights, because when people exercise their rights, if that's against some legislation, then they can find themselves kidnapped and caged. And then you have these horrible situations like the one David Gornowski talks about, is that one fellow in Indiana. Maybe you haven't heard about that one, but this fellow, and David has interviewed him on his radio program. This fellow repaired trucks, and it turns out some of the trucks were transporting marijuana. He was given a sentence of life without parole.
Oh man!
Now you can compare that to other sentences, including the one down in Dallas we just saw, the 10-year, that sort of thing. And you see a lot of examples of this very bizarre sentencing, lack of guidelines. But anyway, David had him on his program, and the guy was talking about it's a horrible subject, but his job in the prison was to make rape-resistant shower curtains.
Oh my God!
So he says. So think of the implications of that. It's a monstrous system, which utilizes terror and has terrible brutality built into it, and shame, the imposition of shame on people who step outside of what the usurpers of power, those who commit treason against the sovereignty of the people, would allow us to do. So I think there's a very strong moral imperative that everyone learn about these techniques. It's grounded in history, it's grounded in morality, it's grounded in philosophy, these things that the 10th Amendment Center and other groups talk about. And again, we talk about nullification and how it really is a path to liberty. And there's so much more we could talk about it. If there's something else that you'd like to bring up now, please feel free.
I want to add one thing. No one ever gained freedom through constant obedience. I mean, I think to me that really hits home. As long as people in large numbers continue to obey everything that the government does in the hopes that the government is going to stop the government from doing what the government is doing today, because that's generally how people approach things. They approach things with the mentality that either a federal court is going to stop the federal government or new federal politicians, when you vote the bums out, are going to somehow stop using all that federal power that's handed to them. Begging government to stop doing what government wants to do is a failed strategy. And the founders told us, you mentioned James Madison in Federalist 46, that's where he famously told us that the way to defeat federal programs, one of 4 things that need to be done is to refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union. That means disobey them. Now, of course, that comes with its own set of dangers, but when enough people say no to Washington, D.C., and enough states or localities help them out and back them up with laws supporting their actions, there's not much the feds can do. They don't have the manpower to enforce all their acts. You mentioned gun control. The ATF has somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 employees for the entire country. A third of them are in administration. They're pencil pushers. They're answering calls, probably still sending faxes these days. They don't have enough enforcement agents to close more than 8,000 to 10,000 cases per year. So what if there were 5 million people? I saw Gun Owners of America tweeted out an article this morning talking about how there were, like somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 bump stocks in the country. Well, the NRA-backed president supposedly decided that those were illegal, and they banned them, and only about a few thousand of them have been turned in. Well, they can pass whatever laws they want, but when people don't turn them in, that law has zero effect. We want them to stop passing those laws, but this is the step forward, and it works.
Okay, that's a very good point. The non-cooperation with the officers of the Union, and I'm wondering too, because you brought up about the ATF, we see these things talking about the 100-mile wide Constitution-free zone around the borders and large bodies of water. So, well, that's on the border there, but they being, is it the CPB, the border, or the CBP, the Border Patrol?
Yeah, and DHS as a general rule, Department of Homeland Security.
In DHS, okay. So what they've said, and of course, if you live, in any one of most of the large urban centers fall within that zone. So now they say you don't have any constitutional rights, or I shouldn't use that phrase. That's the wrong phrase. You don't have any constitutional protections of your rights against federal infringement or tax on your rights. If you're in there, I'm not sure exactly what the answer is for that one, but I did see this one case where some of these people got on a bus that was actually outside of that zone, and there was a woman on the bus.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, she said, "Well, you're not you can't really do this." And so maybe there's got to be I don't know, civil disobedience about that in some way.
There absolutely does. And I know a lot of people on the right have told me over the years, civil disobedience is a tool of the left. Well, it was a tool of Samuel Adams. It was a tool of Patrick Henry, who both told us we are not bound to obey acts not passed in accordance with our own legislatures. So when they don't support the Constitution, we should not submit to them. Of course, for each person, that may be a different risk or what level of risk they want to take. James Madison told us these aren't leftists. So this is not a tool of the left. Just because the left has maybe taken it over doesn't mean we have to allow them to use that as their exclusive tool. We should use the tools that the founders told us to use, and because that's what works. What doesn't work is, again, going to Washington, D.C. and begging Washington, D.C. to stop Washington, D.C. from doing what Washington, D.C. always does, and that is violate our rights. I would say the entire country, unfortunately, is a Constitution-free zone, but it is incumbent upon us to start taking a stand today to whether in our lifetime or the next or the following one, we can see liberty flourish once again.
Right. And just real quickly, I'd like to mention we have had success, for instance, in our own great, beautiful area of Michigan. We've had success on Obamacare. We nullified the healthcare exchange, the state healthcare exchange. We had also essentially nullified the Medicaid expansion until the Republican governor, threw a temper tantrum. And so they went through, they eventually did get that through. But there were other things too. In our own state, we've had a number of legislators who have managed to shepherd through some very good legislation as it turns up from time to time.
Yeah, one of the Fourth Amendment Protection Act is a great piece of legislation that went into law this last summer that bans all Michigan state local agencies from providing what's called material support or resources to warrantless federal surveillance programs. This should be passed in every state in the country, and where it will have the most impact in the short term is in places like Texas and Utah, Washington State, Tennessee, West Virginia, Maryland, where there are Augusta, Georgia as well, where there are active NSA surveillance centers. The NSA, by its very existence, constantly surveilling people, are constantly violating the Constitution and the Fourth Amendment. So why should the states help out? So we believe that the best approach, as the founders told us, is to stop participating in them because the feds rely on our help all the time. And I can go back to the gun control issue, as I always do, or marijuana, as I always do. When enough states stop participating, the feds can't get it done. Now it's up to us to start creating gun rights sanctuary states around the country and prove to people that liberty is awesome.
It is awesome. And the last thing I'll ask you about, I know we're taking a lot of time here, and you're very generous and gracious with your time and your knowledge, Michael. I really do appreciate it. And I'm sure everybody watching would agree with that. One other topic, and I think there's been a little bit of discussion about it here locally, we might become one of the first of the northern states to get in on something that we should be doing, having to do with perhaps getting rid of the sales tax on gold and silver or having a bullion depository in the state. There's some discussion that maybe that would happen. Could you tell us
who's going to carry that? Who's going to carry that legislation?
Well, I'm not sure yet. There's been discussion.
Is Runestad? Will Runestad do it, you think?
Jim might do it, or maybe our Pete Lucido or somebody. I think.
Oh, I know Pete does some good stuff on surveillance, but I didn't know he was on board with
I don't know
sound
if he is.
money.
I'm saying it into the camera. If he
Let's say it publicly, so maybe he knows that we'll love him for doing that. He doesn't just only have to try to stop stingray surveillance and license plate readers, but on the other hand, Pete has been doing good stuff against the surveillance state, trying to ban all kinds of surveillance technologies from their ubiquitous use around state. I know there are a lot of activists, for example, in Detroit, trying to stop facial recognition surveillance. Facial recognition in and of itself cannot follow the state or the federal constitution because it is a mass surveillance tool. You cannot have a warrant based on probable cause and surveil an entire area of stored images of someone's face at the same time. So maybe we don't want to distract Peter Lucido from the work that he's doing on privacy, and hopefully someone else will take the torch on sound money. So the feds actually, they've done so many things to destroy the economy. Clearly, the spending, the existence of the Federal Reserve, the debasement of the monetary system, quantitative easing. We are expecting another one coming again sometime soon. They just keep printing more and more money. But they also create impediments to the use of competing currencies. And I would say that, without getting too detailed, that when people are given an option, there actually can be what's called a reverse Gresham's effect. Some people at some point will decide to use sound money rather than garbage fiat from the Federal Reserve. And some of us will use it on principle, no matter what, as often as we can. One of the first things that you can do to get roadblocks out of the way of use of gold, silver, even crypto, for example, in Wyoming, they're taking this approach on cryptocurrency as well, is to remove the sales tax on its exchange. Think of it this way. You go to a grocery store, you want to buy something for $10. You have a credit card or a debit card that's linked to your gold account at United Precious Metals Association, upma.org. I don't have an account there. They don't sponsor me. I like their business model. They store gold and silver, and they encourage people to use sound money because Utah did what we're talking about here. You remove sales tax. You treat gold and silver as money. But if you have sales tax in the way and you don't treat it as money and you treat it as a capital gains, literally spending $10 at the grocery store, they're going to charge you a sales tax or a capital gains tax on the exchange of that currency. So you might get hit $2, $3 on taxes. And then someone who doesn't have a lot of extra cash on hand, the odds of them using real money as money go much lower when you have taxes on its exchange. So we want to actually just get that layer out of the way, encourage people to use money as money again, and then let the market kind of run with it. And we see things growing in Utah, for example, Texas, where they're building the bullion depository to create a place where you can basically have outside the Federal Reserve System a place to store gold and silver, and then even have a debit card that you can swipe, and in the background it just automatically converts for you, so you can actually use money in commerce. So that would be awesome to see in Michigan.
Well, that would be. And okay, here's the last. This will be the last point, because we talked about.
Unless we got something else that's good, we might get into another.
Well, that's right. Well, but the facial recognition thing. Turns out a friend of mine, a very good friend, who's very active with us, is running. He's going out getting signatures to run for the United States Congress, and I know it's a federal thing, but he's in the 13th congressional district.
Which is who?
Rashida Tlaib.
She's good on facial recognition.
Well, she was just down there at. In Detroit, and she said, "Oh, the problem here is it's a racial problem.
Yeah,
and we need to get only okay.
It's a bad.
And you explained how that's totally wrong.
Okay, so I mean, this is just and maybe Rashida is bad then. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. I know she's bad on a lot of stuff, but on some things, she is opposed to mass warrantless surveillance. Maybe her reason is a bad choice, but I am opposed to mass warrantless surveillance, whether it's a Stingray device or the NSA or facial recognition. And what happened here in California, there was a great piece of legislation that's still kind of okay, AB 1215. It's sitting on the governor's desk. It originally as introduced, would ban the use of facial recognition or any other biometrics on police body cams, because we know that, I think, at least in my view, it's a scam, that the idea that body cameras are going to be used to keep police accountable instead of as a surveillance tool. So some people recognize that police want to spy on you constantly, and then they feed the information through fusion centers to the federal government, and then the feds are spying on you constantly. They're using the local police as a tool. So what happened was most every organization outside the 10th Amendment Center who was supporting this bill here in California was focusing on the racial issue. It is a fact that facial recognition does awful on correctly recognizing people of color. So it does a really bad job on women of color. It does a less bad job on men of color. And on white guys like me, it does a really good job. So it's going to get like 99% right, but a lot of people are going to be incorrectly identified if they're African American. So people keep pointing out, they're like, oh yeah, well, this is a racist tool and it's going to get all the black people in jail. They already are. It's going to make it even worse. And this is true. But if you only focus on that as your message, then what happens is exactly what happened here in California. Instead of being a permanent ban on its use because it's illegal warrantless surveillance, then the people who are supporting the bill instead change it to a temporary one. They change it to a 7-year ban, and then now a 3-year moratorium is what's sitting on the governor's desk, because they're saying, well, let's just give them time to figure out the racial disparities. And you're actually encouraging them to use it as long as it works equally bad on everybody or violates everyone's rights equally. I don't want to violate everyone's rights equally. I don't want anyone's rights to be violated at all. So whoever's running against Rashida, if they're taking a stronger position on facial recognition that it is mass warrantless surveillance and needs to be stopped, then that's a positive.
Yes, and my friend David Dudenhofer does believe that, and so that's
okay. Good.
Yeah, so that's a good thing for Dave, otherwise known as the Dude. Well,
nice.
Yes. Well, Michael, again, you've been extremely generous with your time and knowledge, and we could go on a lot longer because you were a walking encyclopedia on these things, but John Irvine here and his wife Kathy would probably get mad at me for being here till midnight. But
well, we're grateful for them. I'm grateful for you. And Meharry was still better. I still got to see the episode, but
okay.
Mike's always away.
So as we sign off here, please tell our viewing and listening audience ways they may support the 10th Amendment Center.
I think the number one thing people need to do, I'm not going to shill for cash or anything like that. The number one thing people need to do is go to 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. It is our annual white paper talking about the state of the nullification movement. It's about 80 pages. It's still up to date for last year. What we do is we have two main sections. The first part explains in more detail things that we're talking about here, the strategy, the constitutional basis, the legal basis of how to nullify federal acts. And the second part of it is a report on how things are going on various issues in the states around the country, whether it's surveillance, sound money, the right to keep and bear arms, Obamacare, and on and on. So you can see what's going on in various states, and maybe that'll encourage you to take action on something important to you in your own area. We'll update it with the latest information. The first part really pretty much stays the same every year, so you can get the philosophical basis, and then we update the report every year, December or January, with all the legislation that has passed. We've got a few dozen bills that have passed in 2019 that we need to update on. But I think that's the most important thing to do, is get educated and then get active.
Okay, well, that's great. And that can lead folks to other forms of support, including Detroit time, 12:30 on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday to watch The Path for Liberty, which the 10th Amendment Center puts on. And Michael sits right there. You're seeing the backdrop there. And he explains these various things to us. And then, of course, there are ways to support through liking and sharing the things that they come up with, or commenting on them. And also, if you're interested in financial support, of course, that's very useful too. And you'd have to go a long way to find a group that puts your liberty supporting money to better use than the 10th Amendment Center. They're wonderful people doing extremely valuable and necessary work. So with that, thank you very much for watching this episode of Curmudgeonly Conversation. We will be available. This will be available at the ji1776.com. Also at the Cerberus Radio Network, thanks to Suzanne Sherman. Soon these will be available at the Libertarian Institute, and of course I'll be sharing it, and then you can see it on YouTube and all that sort of thing. So Michael Boldin, thank you very much for all of the knowledge and expertise you shared, and being very gracious with your time, and thank you for all you do in defending the cause of liberty.
Cool, and I just want to give a quick shout out. Suzanne Sherman is absolutely awesome. So is Libertarian Institute, run by the great Scott Horton, and I'm very grateful for your time, Dennis, and your friendship. This is really cool. And thanks to John and Kathy for hosting. This is really awesome.
Well, they are awesome folks, and I'm hopeful that we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, I would love to.
Great. Onward and upward. Thanks, Michael.
Onward and upward. Have a great evening.